It's like I just knew exactly what I was going to do. And so the first thing I went to is Walmart. I got some snacks and bottle of pop and the knife. Got the knife. Went to Menards, got the ties, and when I went out to do what I was going to do, I was 100% sure that I was doing something that needed to be done.
A North Dakota Highway Patrol investigation continues into a fatal crash on I-94. Officials say 38-year-old John Bridges was driving this van when it collided with the overpass support column. First responders arrived, the passenger, 40-year-old Lee Clay, dead at the scene. Bridges was transported to a local hospital and the investigation is ongoing.
So what happened then?
We put Lee's bike in the back of the van, and then we started heading down the road.
Then what happened?
We hadn't gotten out of town very far, and that's when the steering wheel just started going like this, just shaking. And then we went into the ditch in between the lanes.
What about his,
when after the accident, you were getting out of the car and you saw Lee, what was Lee looking like?
His neck was just mutilated. I mean, it just looked like, I don't even know how that happened. I mean, I was like, what the hell, I don't know if he tossed around in the back of the van or what. And I tried that. He was making gurgling sounds, sort of like a belching sounds.
You are still detained. Like I said, this is kind of a weird looking death situation. So we're just gonna make sure our T's are crossed and our I's are dotted.
John Bridges is talking about this accident that's happened and the victim essentially succumbing to injuries due to an accident, and it's just not believable. I think what Bridges is showing us is that he has sort of a disconnect from reality in what the rest of us would naturally assume or conclusions we might draw. This is pretty consistent with what we see in psychopathic individuals, where they're not really concerned about fact or integrity to what they're saying or the plausibility of the story. They tend to come across at times as glib and not super concerned about a chronic need to lie or pathological lying that we sometimes see in them.
Mr. Bridges has a sense of grandiosity. He has a sense of grandiosity in that he is trying to out-talk the investigator, talk his way out of any of their suspicions. So he's saying, yes, his neck was mutilated, but don't know what could have happened, as if they're going to fall for that. He's so confident in himself and his abilities to talk himself out of this responsibility. He's discussing this death as if it's just another day driving on the highway, when in fact, he's looking at the scene with mutilated neck. And so in this case, he's trying to pull the wool over, so to speak, the investigator's eyes by acting as if he's being helpful, but really he's withholding the truth.
Highway Patrol has asked me to come in and talk with you and help with the investigation.
Yeah.
And the investigation started with that crash. Anything else you can remember about the day that was weird with you and Lee? Did you guys fight at all? You guys, get along pretty good?
Yeah, I mean, he's like a friend. We're cool.
And I don't want to offend you, but you've not once showed any kind of emotion towards Lee about the fact that he's dead.
I have showed emotion. I mean, as far as like when they told me, you know, it upset me. I mean, what do you want me to break down and cry? I mean,
I think Bridges is starting to make attempts at trying to control the interview. He is trying to figure out what detectives want from him. And that chameleon-like tendency that we see in psychopathic individuals is something that allows them to navigate their environment. They try to figure out what the people they're interacting with want, how they want them to react, how they want them to emote or show emotions, and how they want them to behave. So I think that's really what we're seeing with Bridges, is he's trying to get a read on the detectives.
What I'm trying to say is it just didn't seem like there was anything that bothered you about what happened.
it does bother me. It bothers me a lot. I mean, when you see somebody like that, I mean, you know, there when he took his last breath, I mean, he was gurgling for a while, and then nothing.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of traumatic, but I mean, I'm not an emotional person. I'm not gonna go get a box of Kleenex because of that. I mean, but it's disturbing. When I go to sleep now, yeah, it'll probably bother me even more, just those images.
Typically, whenever people have been involved in a fatal accident such as this, where someone has passed away, you would expect the person to be emotional, perhaps crying, screaming, upset, or almost frozen and unable to speak because of the shock or the trauma. Mr. Bridges is discussing this death as if it's just another day driving on the highway. He is actually demonstrating the shallow affect that's seen in psychopathy. He knows he should say he's upset, but he's not really appearing upset at all. In fact, he's appearing a bit angry.
The thing about this whole thing is I've seen the pictures from the crime scene out there, and I've seen everything, and I've listened to you twice tell the story.
You think that there was foul play?
I think that there was more to the story than what you're telling me.
What doesn't calculate? What doesn't add up?
The injury from here to here doesn't add up. I'm telling you, I think that his injuries happened before you hit the bridge.
So you're saying that you're basically saying that I killed him. That's what you're saying.
Is that what happened?
No, I did not.
He's getting increasingly frustrated, obviously, by the tone in his voice, his posture. He's getting increasingly frustrated at the questioning, and I think recognizing that he's caught. And so he tries to gain control over the interview.
Okay, what we did is I had a chance to go back and look at some of the stuff that was out at the scene. When the officers were there, they had found some zip ties and some duct tape in a sand pile over next to the van. Do you know what that's all about?
You know, I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm looking to just get this resolved. I mean, I know personally that there's no sin. I'm not going to take this to. I'm not going to plead not guilty, and I want to get sent to prison as soon as possible. It's my only demands, and I'll tell you exactly what happened.
Okay.
And you can close this case, and that's it.
He is talking about demands and says that that's my only demand, but really he is not in any position to make demands at all. But that's part of what we see in psychopaths as well, is this, again, this grandiosity, an inflated sense of what he has the authority to do. So this grandiosity leads him to believe that he actually does have the right to be making demands, when in fact he absolutely does not.
Why don't you just go ahead and tell me what happened?
My intentions were to get Lee and Scott restrained in the back of the van so I could have a little talk with them.
What kind of a talk?
To talk about something that I thought that they did, you know, basically I got a vision of everything that I thought that they was doing in my head, like a clear vision.
What did you suspect that they did?
I thought that they used their cell phones to videotape me.
Okay.
At the time, I really didn't think much of it. I was trying not to, because sometimes I get paranoid thoughts, and I just let it go.
John Bridges talks about how he has paranoia and he starts to set the groundwork for being mentally ill or legally incompetent and wanting to strategize his legal case by claiming insanity. And we see this in individuals who are seasoned criminals who know the judicial system, know how to navigate it. The problem we have is that Bridges' description of how he's experiencing these visions isn't consistent with visual hallucinations. It's not consistent with auditory hallucinations. And he goes on to give a fairly accurate accounting that is linear and in order of what he remembers about the scenario in this out-of-body experience, which is highly inconsistent with psychosis and paranoia.
It was so vivid. And when I went out to do what I was going to do, I was 100% sure that I was doing something that needed to be done. First thing I went to is Walmart. I got some snacks and bottle of pop and the knife. Got the knife. Went to Menards. Got the ties. Then I went back to Walmart and got the duct tape.
When Bridges is describing to police what his steps were in terms of shopping for these items, the ties, the knife, the duct tape, he's describing this all very matter-of-factly. His affect is somewhat limited. There's a little bit of glib in what he's saying, and he's describing this as if it was our grocery list and shopping list, and he just went to the store to pick up milk and eggs.
Well, see, I wasn't going to try to do both of them at the same time because all I had was a knife, and I didn't want to, you know, probably it'd be difficult to do two people at the same time. That's what Scott, I'm like, you know, is there any place you want to go, you know, because I need to kind of talk to Lee about something, this person, whatever. I got him to look in the toolbox, you know. I was just using that as a decoy to get him, you know, in the back of the van.
Okay.
And, as soon as he got back there and started looking at it, that's when I slipped up on him. Put the, you know, just held the knife like this. I'm like, look, dude, the other day, somebody called the cops on me. And I'm going to find out who called the cops. And I told him, I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick Scott up. I'm going to find out, make sure I'm going to check his phone and make sure there's nothing there. So the only way you're going to stand a chance of getting out is if you do what I say and you get your hands dirty. And it'll be our little secret, and we'll go our separate ways. It means that basically I was telling him that we'd have to kill Scott together and bury the body, get rid of him.
Mm-hmm.
He seems to be enjoying the thrill, the excitement of having complete domination over the victim and mentally manipulating him. You do what I tell you and you'll survive. But if not, then it's going to be a bad outcome. And he seems to thrive off of that power.
We're driving down the highway.
The next thing I knew, I heard something rattling around back there. And I looked over and I seen the axe handle and I saw him tugging on something. I'm like, oh, this got the axe.
Blaming the victim is part and parcel of a psychopath's MO. It's often someone else's fault. And in this case, Mr. Bridges is blaming the victim. Well, he tried to get out of the zip ties and, he was going to attack me, so I had to attack him back, almost as if it's self-defense.
I lost control of the van. It went in the median. I jumped into the back, and then I took an hour-head knife in my hand, and I drove it in somewhere near his clavicle bone. And it just went straight down. It almost felt like it just ripped or whatever. I mean, it was all soft where it went in. It didn't hit nothing hard. Just went in and down. I stabbed him like at least, I'd say 2 or 3 times more. I was in a zone at that point.
Mr. Bridges uses the words that he was in the zone while he was stabbing the victim. It's typically a term we use for sports or something more positive than murdering someone. For him, in the zone perhaps means he was only focused on completing his goal.
I was so zoned out. All I know is the first one I got, it hit near his clavicle. I immediately pulled the axe out of his hand and I just started chopping the back of his neck, to break his spine, make sure he was dead. The last time I hit him, his head just wobbled like this, and I knew I broke his spine. So I knew he was dead.
Individuals that are psychopathic oftentimes do not experience emotions in the same range that the rest of us do. So oftentimes their highs take more to stimulate and their lows take more to pull them out of. And this may be what we're seeing with Bridges in this moment, is that as he's recalling the details of what he did to the victim in those moments when he was physically stabbing him, he's getting a bit of a secondary high off of that. It's unclear if there really was overkill or if it was a response to the amount of adrenaline he may have been experiencing, but certainly the amount of violence that he committed against the victim was far more than was necessary to render him helpless.
Have you ever killed anyone else? Even in this kind of...
A long time ago, but yeah, I did, I got into a deal where I ended up shooting a couple of people.
Have you been prosecuted for that?
Yeah, I've already served my time. It was in Illinois.
Okay.
The manslaughter. I was convicted of manslaughter.
Okay.
And I served a juvenile time for that.
Speaking of Mr. Bridges' long history of deviant behavior, it's noteworthy that according to the records, he had gotten into multiple fights while he was in school. He threatened his mother with a knife. Reportedly, at age 15, he disclosed that he wanted to kill someone just to see what it was like to kill someone. He ultimately did murder someone by age 16. There's a lot of red flags for psychopathic behavior, starting from early childhood.
I think the main thing I want is I don't want to make a big stink of this thing. I just want to get it done with and over.
Mr. Bridges makes comments such as, I don't want to make a big stink of this, as if he's talking about throwing out days-old leftovers, but he's actually talking about murdering someone. It's yet another attempt of him to control the players in the situation as if he's a puppeteer and he's directing them to do what he wants.
The psychologist has never seen anyone to date that is as psychopathic or as dangerous as you are. You, in essence, have viewed people like animals and you hunt them. Is that what I'm to take from this?
Yeah, I hunt a little bit.
It is very clear to this court that the only way the public is safe is for you to not have an opportunity to prey upon an unsuspecting public again.
911, what's the location of your emergency?
I have no idea where I'm at. I am in the middle of nowhere. We were looking for Shantae Blankenship.
Okay.
We found her.
You okay? Does she need any medical attention?
Is she alive? She's dead.
This is where the Brown County Sheriff's Department found the body of Rhonda Shantae Blankenship on County Road 424. They're calling her death a homicide.
Blankenship died from a crushed larynx and blunt force injuries to her neck, face, and torso. Sheriff Vance Hill says some of those injuries were caused by a lawnmower blade found near her body.
Bryan County law enforcement arrested 21-year-old Ryan Riggs for capital murder. The break in the case came when the sheriff's office released a computerized sketch of Riggs using his DNA. Blankenship and Riggs went to the same church.
Pastor Keener says Riggs then went before the entire congregation and confessed to killing fellow church member Shantae Blankenship before turning himself in.
He said, I need to confess something. And in that confession, he said, I've done something real bad. I murdered her.
You good? You okay? Bottle of water? I'm gonna have one. I just have one. Okay. Sheriff just gave me a call a little while ago and said that you got something off your chest, and we're just gonna see if you tell us what you got off your chest.
I'm the one who murdered Shantae Blankenship.
When did this happen?
On Friday the 13th.
Okay. So this happened on Friday the 13th. Tell me about that day. How did you start that day out?
It was just like an average day to me up until I did what I did.
He says that he's killed Shantae, but there's no real emotion. There's nothing in his body language that suggests that he's experiencing any real stress. He's not shaking. He's not showing any outward or visible signs of stress. He's somewhat matter-of-fact about the whole thing. And those are some of the indications that start to suggest that there is a psychopathic presence.
Where did you find Shantae that day?
She was walking past the mailboxes in Tamarack Mountain. I stopped and asked her if she needed a ride. And she got in my truck, and I asked her if she was going home. She said no. I asked her if she wanted to hang out. She said yes. Whenever I saw her, it's like I've always had this different part of me that it just wants nothing but destruction and evil. And whenever I saw her that day, it took over. I knew what I was trying to get, or what it was trying to get. It wanted to kill somebody. It wanted to rape.
What is it? Your destructive side, is that what you're talking about?
The only thing I can think of what it might be is Satan.
Satan.
He's owning that he has strong impulses to do things that he's told he shouldn't do. He invokes Satan. It feels evil to him. It comes to him very naturally. And so that's what's interesting about him. He's aware of these feelings that he has, these urges that he has to do things that he knows aren't right, but it bothers him that it doesn't bother him.
Riggs slips up in this part of the interview and tells authorities some details about what had taken over in him. But when he switches tracks and refers to himself and his actions as it and identifies it as Satan, what I hear is somebody who actually thought through and contemplated what his story was going to be when he finally did confess to authorities, and he forgot. He had a moment where he forgot that he had planned to distance himself from his own actions, that it was something inside of him, like a monster, that did this, not himself. And that subtle switch where he says, I, and then switches to it is somewhat significant and more consistent with psychopathic behavior and not a misunderstood teenager.
When y'all were sitting in the truck talking, what are y'all talking about?
Music.
What y'all liked, or what was playing, or what?
Well, I had a sound system in my truck, so I was letting her go through all my music and stuff. And I was talking to her about the music that she liked. And every time she'd play a song, she'd say something like, oh, that's my song.
The way that Riggs hangs out with Shantae and describes that they're sitting in the car, they're flirting, they're listening to music.
There is an element of manipulation in this, that he is basically trying to pull her in and get her to feel comfortable. It is an effort to disarm her so that ultimately he'll have greater control and power over her.
I'm not sure what exactly I wanted. I just don't know how to describe it. I wanted both things to happen, the rape and the murder.
Did Friday the 13th play a role in this?
No, it's just, as soon as I seen her, it's just something that wasn't me came over me. We went down in there, and it's surrounded by trees, and we parked, and we were sitting in the truck for a while. And then, out of nowhere, I just put my left arm around her and began to strangle her. And whenever she had passed out, I took her clothes off and I raped her. And then afterwards, I went to that abandoned house on County Road 424. And I dragged her body out of my truck. Then I threw her over that fence and then climbed over the fence and dragged her to that tank battery where I put her. I went back to my truck and got a lawnmower blade out of the back of my truck. And I went back to where she was and I beat her to death with it to make sure that she was dead.
Do you think she was dead before that?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Why do you not think so?
Because parts of her body were still moving and twitching.
Were her eyes open or closed?
Her eyes were open, but they were open the entire time.
What he chose to do was harm her, torture her, drag her off, and then bludgeon her. And all of those indications suggest somebody who's got paraphilic interests. Paraphilias are deviant sexual interests. What we're talking about is an individual who gets sexually aroused by creating harm and fear in their victims. The non-consensual component of that sexual activity is the point of arousal.
Now, did you use anything else hitting her besides the lawnmower blade?
I remember putting a knife to her throat, even though it wasn't sharp at all.
This is an example of his sadistic tendencies and desires. He is going above and beyond. At this point, she's presumably already dead, which is a very personal action to take and full of rage. So it's an enhanced level of sadism that he is getting some sort of pleasure out of being so violent with her.
The clothes you were wearing that night, what were you wearing?
I don't even remember. I know I was wearing shorts, that's for sure.
What did you do with those clothes?
Probably just kept them. I didn't try to dispose of them or anything.
What kind of shoes were you wearing?
I was wearing some Jordans that I used to have.
Where are those shoes now?
In the garbage. I threw them away a long time ago.
So you kept them for a little while?
I kept them for a while.
How come you kept them?
I just thought that they were good shoes.
Riggs may have been keeping the shoes because functionally they were nice shoes, but more likely he kept them as a trophy. He kept them as a reminder of the crime and what he had done. And the dubious part about it is that they were hidden in plain sight. They were part of the weapons used in this crime that harmed her. And ultimately, nobody at that point suspected that he had anything to do with Shantae's disappearance, much less her rape and her murder. And to walk around with those shoes on for some time after she was killed and found really does start to speak to someone who was reliving it.
How did you know Shantae?
Well, she was widely known in that community, so everyone knows everyone out there. She went to church, the same church I went to. My parents would pick her up and give her rides sometimes. Sometimes I feel like that she liked me and she was always trying to flirt. I didn't want anything to do with that.
When you say she would flirt with you, what would she do?
She would just joke and just talk and laugh.
Right.
But I would just block her out, pretend she wasn't there.
His victim selection is really important to his MO. He's keeping it close to home. He very easily could have gone somewhere else to find a victim in a different community and then just come back. Part of targeting her is because her absence will be noted that's doing something for him. It calls to mind like the arsonist who goes to watch the fire in a way.
Riggs is someone that it's hard to know what his motivation was towards the negative feelings he had towards Shantae. But what does seem to emerge is this sense of jealousy. The community was protective of her. They made room for her. Riggs may have had some jealousy that he himself didn't feel protected or loved or wanted, that the community hadn't made such room for him and embraced him. And as a result, that may have been some hostility that played out during the crime as well.
Let's say this, like, how many times had you met her before or hung out?
Well, actually hanging out, probably just a handful of times, like 4 or 5 times. Whenever she just happened to be with the same people that I was with. Usually, we would just hang out like at the pool.
Through all that time, you knew she was a little bit mentally handicapped.
Yes.
Do you think that played a role in this for you?
I think whatever came over me knew that she was an easy target.
You think that's because she was a small girl or because she had the mental problems or both?
Individuals who are psychopaths purposely target the weaker and the more vulnerable because they can be easy targets. He viewed her as an easy target because of her size and her cognitive limitations. And it's an opportunity for him to take control, exact his will and desires, and not have to fight too hard for it.
Is this something you're thinking about doing, or is it just something when you woke up that morning that those thoughts came over you?
Well, before I had seen Shantae walking, I had decided to go for a drive in my truck because sometimes I just like to drive around the community and blare loud music. And whenever I was driving and I had seen her, just immediately it was like something else would come over me.
So she just happened to be in the wrong spot? You think it's just you saw her and knew her and thought, this is somebody that'll work for this? Do you know?
It's like I didn't have any thought process at all. My eyes were watching me do what I was doing, but there was no thought behind it. Just one evil.
You said that you had seen her walking around before, right? Of course, she walks around there all the time. Before this day, had you ever seen her walking and go, one of these days? Or was it just a spur of the moment deal that night?
It was just on that moment. I had never had any type of thoughts like that about her.
Had you ever had those type of thoughts about anybody before?
Not anyone specific, but wanting to do that to a person, yes.
How long have you been having those thoughts before this happened?
I've always had these thoughts. It's always been like I've been living with a different part of me. Sometimes it's me and sometimes it's something else that just wants evil and nastiness.
He's saying it's evil in me, but it's him. When he says nothing's going through his mind, I don't think that's actually how it's happening. I don't think he's lying, but I think he has a hard time kind of tapping into the part of his brain that feels just very natural doing these things that seem so unnatural to most people.
What made you decide to talk to her?
These past couple of days, I've been trying to figure out what it is that I need to do.
Now, about a week ago, when we started knocking on your door and stuff, we released a composite profile picture to the media. Did you see that?
Yeah.
What did you think when you saw that?
I remember thinking, I hope that no one sees this and tells them that they know someone who looks like that.
So Riggs' decision to confess was not because he was overcome by guilt. It's not because he was overcome by regret or remorse for what he had done to another human being. It's because he knew that he was going to be found. It may have been his attempt to remain in control of the narrative, which is, I'm a good person who did a bad thing, and I have all this remorse and regret.
I can't imagine what you've been going through for the past year and a half. The anxiety, you know, has it gotten to you pretty hard? Had you tried to kill yourself before?
Yes.
Yeah. Before this last week?
Yes. I've tried to kill myself on numerous occasions, before and after what I did to Shanti. So I've always known that there was another part of me that wasn't good.
Hard to say about his expression of suicidality, if he genuinely had been suicidal or if he's saying it in order to garner sympathy and perhaps impact the outcome of his case, or maybe it's a little bit of both. But his other actions and statements throughout this interview and in the records do not paint the picture of someone who is riddled with grief and remorse over his actions.
You said you hadn't done this to other people. Have you done it to other things like animals, livestock, anything like that?
We used to have a Chihuahua, and sometimes I would get the same feelings that I did whenever I saw Shantae. I tried on numerous occasions to drown that Chihuahua in a 5-gallon bucket of water. I would try to hold it there until it would stop kicking and struggling.
This is an early red flag for future violent behavior, even sadistic behavior. Individuals who hurt those that are more vulnerable to them, whether we're talking about an animal or a human being, are people who tend to be particularly callous and not have the same respect for humanity that the majority of society does. So this small animal was another easy victim for him.
But I would just hold it there long enough to where I would just think to myself, what am I doing? And then I'd make myself stop. But I never told anyone about that either.
You were arrested, 2012 for burglary? You remember that?
I remember I was arrested whenever I was 14, or I was arrested whenever I was 15. I was just always doing something.
What else? What other kind of stuff were you doing?
Mostly just drug abuse. Buying drugs, doing drugs, running around.
Were you selling drugs?
Sometimes if I needed a little bit extra money. I started smoking weed whenever I was 15 years old. I started using meth. First time I used meth, I was 19.
When we get into drug use and drug experimentation, we're in that novelty-seeking realm. One of the features with psychopathy can be just increased stimulation needs, that they need something new. They need something stimulating, exciting, and that can frequently be drugs. That could be a lot of other things, but we're seeing that in his own description.
There are a lot of people at the church tonight. You were up there.
No, there wasn't that many people.
What was their reaction when you told them?
They all told me that I was doing the right thing. Went up to the front of the church and told everybody what I did.
I shouldn't be shocked that he did this, and we saw that troubled look in his eyes that's always been there until last Wednesday night. And he got mixed up in that experience out there at the Juvenile Detention Center. And I don't know if it surfaced in y'all's records, but he stole a gun, and all of that mess. And that was right before his 16th birthday. You could just see where he was headed. That's what hurts me, is that why I didn't pick up on that way back in May of 2016 is thinking, wonder if Ryan did that.
None of us have a crystal ball.
But he's been a troubled child from day one. I have replayed that in my mind. I didn't get that. I mean, right there at the search that Sunday afternoon, on the 15th, he was there. He was there at our service.
He was there in front of us the whole time.
Yeah.
We just never knew who he was.
Psychopathic individuals are difficult to spot, oftentimes because they're highly motivated to manipulate people and to become what we call chameleon-like. They know how to mimic just the surface of typical human behaviors and emotions. Riggs was someone who blended into the community. The sheer fact that he went undetected as long as he did speaks to his willingness and ability to manipulate others and to pretend.
Why did it take you a year and a half to confess, Mr. Riggs? Why did it take you 18 months to confess? On my face.
In Philadelphia, some murder cases end with an arrest. Some end with a conviction. And some remain open long after the investigators, witnesses, and even the people at the center of the case have disappeared. The story of the Frankfurt slasher belongs to that last category. But what makes this case especially unsettling is not simply the number of women whose deaths were eventually connected to the name. It is the contradiction at the center of the investigation. Leonard Christopher was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted for the murder of Carol Dowd in 1990. He received a life sentence. He was, in the eyes of the court, responsible for that particular death. Yet Leonard Christopher was never proven to be the man behind the entire series of killings that had haunted the Frankfurt area for years. And there was another problem, one that made the question even harder to ignore. On September 6, 1990, Michelle Denner was murdered while Christopher was already in custody. If the person responsible for Denner's death was the same person who had killed the other women, then Leonard Christopher could not have been the killer in that case. Investigators considered the possibility that Denner's murder was a copycat killing. But even that explanation could not completely erase the central question. If Christopher was not the Frankfurt slasher, then who was? The name Frankfurt slasher itself can be misleading. It sounds as though investigators identified a particular murderer and gave him a nickname. They did not. The term was a media label for an unidentified person who was believed to have murdered a number of women in and around Frankfurt between 1985 and 1990. The broader series is generally associated with approximately 8 or 9 deaths. Although the exact list is not completely settled. Catherine M. Jones, for example, is included in some accounts but not all, and her connection to the series remains disputed. That uncertainty is important. In a case like this, a list of victims can easily become treated as a fact simply because it has been repeated often enough. But repetition is not proof. What can be said is that several women were killed under circumstances that investigators considered sufficiently similar to raise the possibility of a serial offender. They were attacked with knives. Some showed signs of sexual assault. Their bodies were sometimes left in positions that appeared to have been deliberately arranged. And several victims had connections to the same part of Philadelphia, including bars along or near Frankfurt Avenue. In the mid-1980s, Frankfurt was a neighborhood shaped by contrasts. It contained residential streets, industrial areas, railroad lines, bars, and quieter spaces where people could disappear from public view within a relatively short distance. It was in this environment, in August 1985, that the case began with the death of Helen Patton. Patton was approximately 51 or 52 years old. Her body was discovered in a railroad area near Penn and Bridge Streets by transportation workers. The scene was disturbing. She had been partially undressed. Her body had been left in a sexually suggestive position, and she had suffered numerous stab wounds. Different sources have reported different numbers of wounds. Some records cited in accounts of the case give 19 stab wounds, while other commonly repeated descriptions give a higher number. Because the available accounts are inconsistent, the exact figure should not be presented as certain. What matters more is the pattern. A woman had been violently stabbed, her clothing had been disturbed, and her body had been positioned in a way that appeared deliberate. At that moment, however, investigators did not yet have enough information to say that Philadelphia was facing a serial killer. One murder, no matter how disturbing, does not automatically reveal a pattern. The circumstances surrounding Helen Patton's death had to be investigated on their own. There was no established connection to another homicide. There was no known offender whose name could be attached to the crime. There was no composite sketch pointing investigators toward a particular man. There was only a dead woman and a scene that demanded answers. Then, months later, another woman died. On January 3, 1986, Anna Carroll, approximately 67 years old, was found dead. Carroll had also been attacked with a knife, and investigators noted similarities between her death and Patton's. Yet similarities alone were still not enough to establish that the same person was responsible. Philadelphia was a large city. Violent crime was not rare. Two women dying in separate incidents did not automatically prove the existence of a serial killer. But the possibility was becoming harder to dismiss. Then came Christmas Day, 1986. On December 25th, Susanna Alsop, approximately 64 years old, became another victim. Once again, the circumstances contained elements that resembled the earlier killings. She was a woman connected in some way to the Frankfurt area and to the social world surrounding its bars. Once again, there were signs of a knife attack and indications of sexual assault. Once again, the body was found under circumstances that investigators could compare with the earlier cases. 3 deaths could still be explained separately, but 3 similar deaths began to create a question. Then came the 4th. On January 8, 1987, only about 2 weeks after Alsop's death, 28-year-old Jean Durkin was murdered. Her case became one of the most frequently discussed in connection with the Frankfurt slasher. Accounts describe extensive knife wounds, with some sources reporting as many as 74. Her death also contained the same disturbing combination of violent stabbing and signs of sexual assault that had appeared in earlier cases. At this point, the pattern was no longer easy to ignore, for women had died. The victims were not all the same age. They did not form one obvious demographic group, but the circumstances surrounding their deaths appeared to overlap in ways that demanded attention. And somewhere within those similarities, investigators began searching for a person who could explain them. The emerging theory was frighteningly simple. A serial killer might be operating in Philadelphia. Yet the investigation would soon become more complicated than a search for one violent offender. Witnesses began describing a man they believed they had seen with some of the victims before their deaths. He was described as a white, middle-aged man. That description would become one of the most important clues in the entire case. It would also become one of the reasons Leonard Christopher would later fail to fit neatly into the theory of the Frankfurt slasher. Before Christopher entered the story, investigators were looking for an unknown man. A man whose name they did not know. A man whose face could only be reconstructed from memory. A man who, if the witnesses were correct, had been close enough to some of the victims shortly before they died. The police eventually used witness descriptions to create a sketch in an attempt to identify him. But the sketch did not lead investigators to a confirmed suspect. The face remained without a name, and the deaths continued. By the time the investigation reached its later stages, the list of possible victims would include Helen Patton, Anna Carroll, Susanna Alsop, Jean Durkin, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Ciortino, Carol Dowd, and Michelle Denner, with Catherine M. Jones appearing in some accounts as a disputed possible victim. Their ages range from the late 20s to the late 60s. Their deaths were separated by months and, in some cases, much longer periods. That irregular timeline created another uncertainty. Was there truly one killer? Had the same person returned repeatedly to the same part of Philadelphia? Or had several unrelated crimes gradually been grouped together because investigators noticed similarities? Those questions would become increasingly important as the investigation moved toward 1990. The name Frankfurt Slasher had begun to represent something larger than any individual homicide. It represented an unanswered theory, a pattern without a confirmed perpetrator, a collection of deaths connected by similarities, geography, and witness accounts, but never conclusively tied to one person. And then came Carol Dowd. Her death would finally give investigators something they had not possessed in the earlier cases: a suspect with a direct connection to the victim. That man's name was Leonard Christopher. By the time his name entered the investigation, the case had already been haunting Philadelphia for years. The police had an unidentified man described by witnesses. They had multiple dead women. They had recurring similarities between the crimes. And now they had someone who knew one of the victims and worked near where her body was discovered. The investigation was about to move from the search for an unknown killer to the prosecution of a specific man. But that transition would not answer the mystery. Instead, it would create an even deeper one, because Leonard Christopher could be convicted of Carol Dowd's murder. He could be sent to prison for life. But the larger question would remain: was the man sitting behind bars actually the person who had been called the Frankfurt Slasher? And if he was not, then somewhere in the shadows of Philadelphia, the real identity of that killer remained unknown. To understand why the Frankfurt Slasher investigation became so difficult, it is necessary to begin with the women themselves. They were not simply names arranged on a police timeline. Each had an age, a life, habits, relationships, and a place within the community. Yet as their deaths accumulated, those individual identities were gradually pulled into a single frightening narrative. Helen Patton was the woman whose death, in August 1985, would later be regarded as the beginning of the suspected series. She was approximately 51 or 52 years old. Her body was discovered in a railroad area near Penn and Bridge Streets in Frankfurt by transportation workers. The circumstances immediately suggested violence. Patton had been partially undressed. Her body had been left in a sexually suggestive position, and she had suffered numerous stab wounds. The exact number of wounds varies among sources, with some accounts giving 19 and others reporting a higher figure. That discrepancy is worth preserving rather than smoothing over, because the surviving accounts of the Frankfurt Slasher case are not completely consistent. What is consistent is the essential picture: Patton had been violently stabbed, her clothing had been disturbed, and the position of her body appeared significant. At that stage, however, no one could say that her death was the beginning of a serial murder investigation. There was no established pattern. There was only one homicide. Months later, Anna Carroll entered the story. On January 3, 1986, Carroll, approximately 67 years old, was found dead. Her case contained similarities to Patton's. Carroll had also been attacked with a knife, and circumstances surrounding her death caused investigators to compare the two cases. But two similar murders could still be coincidence. In a city as large as Philadelphia, investigators had to resist the temptation to connect crimes simply because they shared disturbing characteristics. The question was not whether the deaths looked similar. The question was whether the same person was responsible. That question became harder after Christmas Day, 1986. Susanna Alsop, approximately 64 years old, was found dead on December 25th. Her death added another layer to the emerging pattern. Alsop had been connected to the Frankfurt area and was known to frequent a bar in the neighborhood. Accounts describe her as a retired nurse who had experienced problems with her knees. Those details matter because they help illustrate something investigators were beginning to notice. The women did not necessarily share the same age, background, or circumstances, but several had connections to the same social environment around Frankfurt Avenue. They were women who could be encountered in the same neighborhood, sometimes in the same bars, and sometimes moving through the same streets. That common geography became increasingly important. Then, on January 8, 1987, 28-year-old Jean Durkin was killed. Her death was one of the most violent associated with the series. Some accounts report that she suffered as many as 74 stab wounds. Once again, there were indications of sexual assault. Once again, the circumstances resembled those surrounding the earlier victims. But Durkin's age also demonstrated why the pattern could not be reduced to a simple preference for elderly women. Patton had been in her early 50s. Carol and Alsop had been in their 60s. Durkin was only 28. The age range was widening. The similarities seemed to lie somewhere else. Knife attacks, sexual assault, bodies left in positions that appeared deliberately arranged, connections to the Frankfurt area, and, according to witness accounts, possible encounters with the same kind of man before death. It was around this period that the theory of a serial killer became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Another woman, Catherine M. Jones, 29, was also killed in January 1987 and was later included in some lists of possible Frankfurt slasher victims. But her case illustrates one of the most important cautions surrounding this investigation. Not every death attributed to the series is universally accepted as part of it. Jones's connection remains disputed. Some accounts include her. Others do not treat the connection as established. That uncertainty may seem like a technical detail, but it changes how the entire case should be understood. If investigators were dealing with one serial killer, identifying the true victim list was essential. Every additional name could create false patterns. Every excluded name could hide a genuine connection. The investigation, therefore, had to move carefully through incomplete and sometimes conflicting information. The victim's connections to Frankfurt Avenue became another important part of the picture. Several women were known to frequent bars in the area. Goldie's Bar is one location repeatedly mentioned in accounts of the case. This does not prove that the killer selected his victims inside that establishment, nor does it prove that every woman who visited the bar was targeted. But it created a possible point of contact. A person who regularly spent time in the same neighborhood could potentially encounter different women without having to travel far. For investigators, geography could become as important as forensic evidence. If the same person was repeatedly approaching women within a limited area, the streets, bars, and businesses of Frankfurt could provide a framework for understanding how the crimes were connected. Yet there was another detail that would become even more significant: witness descriptions of a man. Some witnesses reportedly remembered seeing certain victims with a white, middle-aged man shortly before their deaths. Police developed a composite sketch based on these descriptions. The man was not simply an abstract possibility. Witnesses believed they had actually seen someone accompanying victims. That gave investigators a potential path toward identifying the offender. But a witness description is not the same as a name, and a composite sketch is not a photograph. The person described remained unidentified. No confirmed suspect emerged from the sketch. And because the killings occurred over a period of years, memories could not easily be transformed into certainty. The investigation therefore contained an uncomfortable contradiction. On one side was a developing pattern that suggested a single offender. On the other was the absence of a confirmed identity. The women were dead, the similarities were accumulating, and witnesses had offered descriptions. But the person they described remained out of reach. Then the series appeared to change pace. After the killings associated with early 1987, there was a significant gap before Margaret Vaughn was killed on November 11, 1988. Vaughn was approximately 66 years old. If her death was connected to the earlier cases, then the person responsible had apparently not followed a regular timetable. There had been a long period of silence. That silence could mean many things. It could indicate that the killer had stopped temporarily. It could mean that the offender had changed locations. Or it could suggest that some of the earlier murders were not connected after all. The evidence did not provide an easy answer. On January 19, 1989, 30-year-old Teresa Sciortino became another suspected victim. Her death extended the pattern into a fifth year. Again, the circumstances contained similarities to the earlier cases, including the use of a knife and indications of sexual assault. By now, the possibility of a continuing series had become impossible to ignore. Yet the investigation still lacked the one thing that could bring the pattern to a conclusion: a perpetrator who could be conclusively tied to the crimes. Philadelphia was also dealing with numerous other homicides during this period. Investigators were not working in an empty city where one unusual murder received unlimited attention and resources. They were operating in an environment where hundreds of homicide cases could demand attention in a single year. The Frankfurt cases therefore existed within a much larger landscape of violence that made pattern recognition more important, but it also made the possibility of fragmented investigations more understandable. Then came April 29, 1990. Carol Dowd, approximately 44 to 46 years old, was murdered. Her body was discovered behind a seafood store on Frankfurt Avenue. For the first time in the history of the suspected series, investigators had a man with a direct connection to the victim and the location. His name was Leonard Christopher. Christopher worked at the seafood store. He knew Dowd, and the place where her body was found was directly connected to his workplace. The investigation was about to enter a new phase. Until that point, the Frankfurt slasher had been an unknown figure suggested by patterns, witness descriptions, and geography. Now police had an identifiable suspect. But the existence of a suspect would not necessarily solve the mystery. In fact, it would eventually make the case even more complicated. Because before Leonard Christopher could become the answer to the Frankfurt slasher mystery, investigators would have to confront a basic question: could they actually connect him to Carol Dowd's death? And could they connect him to the women who had died before her? The distinction between those two questions would become crucial. Christopher might be responsible for Dowd. He might be innocent of Dowd's murder. Or he might have been involved in one crime while another person was responsible for the larger series. And behind all of these possibilities stood the unidentified man described by witnesses, the white, middle-aged figure who seemed to belong to a different version of the case. As investigators turned their attention toward Leonard Christopher, the women who had died before Carol Dowd remained the unanswered foundation of the investigation. Their names were already part of the case. Their deaths had already created the pattern. But the person who had created that pattern, if there truly was one person, still had no confirmed name. By the spring of 1990, the Frankfurt investigation had reached a point that investigators had been waiting for since the first suspected killing 5 years earlier. They finally had a name. On April 29th, Carol Dowd, approximately 44 to 46 years old, was found dead behind a seafood store on Frankfurt Avenue. The location immediately mattered. This was not simply another body discovered somewhere in the city. It was a place connected directly to Leonard Christopher, a 38-year-old man who worked at the seafood store. Christopher also knew Dowd. For investigators, that relationship created something that had been missing from many of the earlier cases: a direct connection between a victim, a location, and a potential suspect. On May 5, 1990, Christopher was arrested and charged with Dowd's murder. The arrest represented a dramatic change in the direction of the investigation. For years, the Frankfurt slasher had existed as an unidentified figure. Investigators had a series of disturbing deaths, similarities between crime scenes, and witness accounts describing a white, middle-aged man. Now they had an identifiable defendant. But identifying a suspect and proving a murder are two different things. The case against Christopher would depend largely on circumstances rather than a single piece of physical evidence that could definitively establish what had happened to Dowd. Christopher's connection to Dowd was significant. He worked near the location where her body was discovered, and investigators believed his relationship with the victim gave him an opportunity to encounter her. But opportunity alone does not establish guilt. The prosecution also focused on Christopher's behavior during the investigation, including statements that investigators considered inconsistent or untruthful. Such statements could become important to a prosecution because they might suggest that a suspect was attempting to conceal something, but again, they were not equivalent to an eyewitness account of a killing. The physical evidence presented another problem. Investigators reportedly found a pair of Christopher's pants containing a very small bloodstain. At first glance, such evidence might appear significant. A bloodstain on clothing can potentially become a direct connection between a suspect and a victim. But in this case, the stain was extremely limited. It could not establish a blood type, and the forensic technology necessary to perform the kind of DNA identification investigators might use today was not available to resolve the question in the way modern investigators might expect. There was therefore a fundamental limitation. The presence of a tiny blood stain did not establish that it belonged to Carol Dowd. It did not demonstrate when the blood had appeared on the clothing, and it did not provide a definitive scientific link between Christopher and the murder. The case consequently depended heavily on the totality of circumstances. Christopher knew Dowd. He worked close to where her body was found. Investigators considered his behavior suspicious. There was physical evidence that appeared potentially relevant, but was not conclusive. And there was no clear, independently verified alibi that removed him from consideration in the way investigators wanted. These elements were enough to bring Christopher to trial. But the larger Frankfurt slasher investigation presented a problem that was impossible to ignore. If Christopher had been responsible for the earlier killings, where was the evidence connecting him to them? The women who had died before Dowd had been killed under circumstances that investigators believed were similar, yet there was no established physical evidence showing that Christopher had been responsible for Helen Patton's death in 1985. There was no established evidence connecting him to Anna Carroll. There was no established evidence connecting him to Susanna Alsop or Jean Durkin. The same problem existed with the other suspected victims. A theory could connect the cases. Similarities could connect them. But a theory was not the same thing as proof. Even more troubling was the description of the unidentified man provided by witnesses. Some witnesses had reported seeing victims with a white, middle-aged man shortly before their deaths. Police had developed a sketch from these descriptions. Christopher did not fit that description. He was an African-American man, not the white, middle-aged man described by those witnesses. If those eyewitness accounts were accurate, they created a serious obstacle to the idea that Christopher was the person behind the entire series. There was also no evidence described in the available case material showing that Christopher had been the man in those encounters. The distinction was becoming increasingly important. Investigators could believe that Christopher was responsible for Carol Dowd's murder without necessarily believing that he was the unidentified Frankfurt slasher. Those were separate propositions. The public, however, could easily merge them. A man arrested in connection with one of the murders associated with a suspected serial killer could quickly become known as the killer himself. But the legal case was narrower. Christopher was charged with Dowd's death. He was not being prosecuted for every unsolved killing that had been associated with the Frankfurt slasher name. The difference would later become central to how the case was understood. As the prosecution moved forward, the question was therefore not simply whether Christopher looked suspicious. It was whether the available evidence was sufficient to establish beyond the required legal standard that he had killed Carol Dowd. The defense challenged the interpretation of the evidence. Attorney Jack McMahon argued against the prosecution's theory and questioned the significance of the circumstances being used against Christopher. The issue of a possible robbery was particularly important. Investigators had considered whether Dowd's death might have involved the taking of property, but her wallet still contained money. That weakened a straightforward robbery explanation. It also raised a broader question about motive. If Christopher had killed Dowd, what exactly had been the purpose of the attack? The available information did not provide a simple answer. The prosecution did not need to establish a perfect motive to obtain a conviction, but the absence of a clear explanation contributed to the uncertainty surrounding the case. The blood evidence also remained limited. Without a reliable blood type or DNA match, the tiny stain on Christopher's pants could not carry the kind of scientific certainty that modern audiences might instinctively associate with forensic evidence. It was evidence that could be considered, but its meaning was ambiguous. That ambiguity is important when looking back at a case from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Investigators were operating with forensic tools that were far more limited than those available today. Evidence that might now be tested through advanced DNA analysis could once have remained inconclusive. A stain could exist without providing an identity. Biological material could be collected without producing a definitive answer. A witness could remember a face without being able to provide a name. And investigators could be left with a collection of fragments rather than a single decisive fact. Yet despite those limitations, the prosecution moved forward. Christopher was ultimately convicted of Carol Dowd's murder on December 12, 1990, and received a life sentence. Legally, the case against him had reached its conclusion, but the larger mystery had not. In fact, events surrounding the investigation had already created a problem that would make the idea of Christopher as the Frankfurt slasher much more difficult to sustain. On September 6, 1990, while Christopher was already in custody awaiting the conclusion of his case, another woman was murdered. Her name was Michelle Denner. She was 30 years old. Her death occurred on Arrett Street in the Frankfurt area, and accounts describe multiple stab wounds, with one source recording 23 wounds to the chest and abdomen. The similarities to the earlier killings immediately mattered. Denner had connections to the same social environment around Frankfurt Avenue and was reportedly seen with a white, middle-aged man before her death. If the person responsible for the earlier killings was also responsible for Denner's murder, Christopher could not have been that person. He was already behind bars. Investigators considered the possibility that Denner's death was a copycat killing, meaning that another offender had deliberately imitated characteristics associated with the earlier series. That explanation offered one way to preserve the theory that Christopher was responsible for Dowd, while separating Denner's death from the original killer. But it did not solve the larger mystery. It simply created another possibility. Perhaps there had been a serial killer and then a copycat. Perhaps there had been multiple offenders. Perhaps the similarities between the cases had led investigators to connect crimes that were never committed by the same person. Or perhaps Christopher had been convicted for a murder he did not commit while the real offender remained unidentified. None of these possibilities could be resolved by the conviction alone. The courtroom had answered one narrow question. Leonard Christopher was legally responsible for Carol Dowd's death. It had not answered the question that had haunted the Frankfurt investigation since 1985. Who was the person behind the broader pattern of killings? That question became even more troubling because the unidentified white, middle-aged man described by witnesses remained without a confirmed identity. If those witnesses had correctly remembered the person they saw with the victims, then investigators had been searching for someone who looked very different from Christopher. And if the Denner killing was not connected to the original series, then another offender had demonstrated that the pattern could be repeated. By the end of 1990, the Frankfurt slasher case therefore stood at a strange crossroads. There was a conviction. There was a life sentence. There was a defendant who continued to maintain his innocence. There was a series of suspected murders that had never been conclusively attributed to him. And there was another woman dead after Christopher had already been taken into custody. The arrest had produced a legal answer to the death of Carol Dowd. It had not produced a definitive answer to the mystery of the Frankfurt slasher. And that distinction would remain the central unresolved issue of the case. By the time Leonard Christopher was taken into custody in May 1990, the Frankfurt investigation had already accumulated years of uncertainty. Police had a suspected series of killings, several victims whose deaths shared disturbing characteristics, and a collection of witness statements that pointed toward a man whose identity remained unknown. Christopher's arrest changed the focus of the investigation, but it did not erase the evidence that had come before him. If anything, the existence of those earlier witness accounts became more important. The most persistent description was that of a white, middle-aged man seen with some of the women shortly before their deaths. Investigators treated those observations seriously enough to develop a composite sketch. The sketch represented an attempt to transform imperfect memories into something useful. A witness might remember a face, glasses, an approximate age, or a distinctive manner of walking, but remembering a stranger with enough precision to identify him years later was difficult. The composite, therefore, could only provide investigators with a direction, not a confirmed identity. That distinction mattered enormously. A sketch can suggest who investigators should look for. It cannot prove that the person depicted committed a crime. In the Frankfurt case, the problem was compounded by the passage of time. The suspected killings stretched from 1985 into 1990. Witnesses were being asked to remember encounters that might have lasted only a short time, often in circumstances involving bars and nighttime activity. The available information does not establish that every witness had the same level of certainty, nor does it provide a definitive identification of the man. What it does establish is that the description became significant enough to form part of the investigative theory. Several women had reportedly been seen in the company of a white, middle-aged man before their deaths. That repeated detail gave the investigation a potential human face, but not a name. It also created a major contradiction once Christopher became the principal suspect in Carol Dowd's murder. Christopher did not match the racial description provided by those witnesses. If the witnesses were correct, then the man they remembered was someone else. Investigators therefore faced a difficult choice in interpreting the evidence. They could treat the witness descriptions as unreliable or unrelated to the murders. They could believe that the man existed but had nothing to do with the killings. Or they could consider the possibility that the descriptions pointed toward the person responsible for some or all of the suspected series. None of these possibilities could be established conclusively from the available evidence. The problem was not merely that the man remained unidentified. It was that his existence challenged any simple explanation of the entire case. If Christopher had killed Carol Dowd, then the unidentified man could still have been responsible for earlier murders. If Christopher had not killed Dowd, then the unknown man could potentially have represented the missing link in the investigation. And if different offenders had committed different murders, then the composite might have represented one of several unrelated suspects. The investigation, therefore, became a process of separating what was known from what was only suspected. The geography of the crimes offered another possible connection. Frankfurt Avenue and the surrounding neighborhood appeared repeatedly in the accounts. Several victims were known to frequent bars in the area. The neighborhood contained residential streets, businesses, industrial areas, railroad lines, and less populated spaces. But again, the presence of a common location did not automatically establish a single killer. A person could encounter many unrelated people in the same neighborhood. A bar could be visited by dozens or hundreds of residents. A street could become the scene of multiple unrelated crimes. Investigators had to determine whether the geography reflected offender behavior or simply the normal concentration of crime within a particular urban environment. The repeated appearance of bars in the victims' histories was therefore suggestive but not conclusive. The same caution applied to the similarities in the killings. The use of a knife appeared repeatedly. There were indications of sexual assault in several cases. The victims' bodies were sometimes left in positions that appeared sexually suggestive or deliberately arranged. Those characteristics were disturbing and potentially important from an investigative perspective. But they were not unique enough by themselves to establish that one offender was responsible for every death. The possibility of a copycat became particularly important after Michelle Denner was murdered in September 1990. Christopher was already in custody by then. If Denner's killing truly belonged to the same series, Christopher could not have committed it. Investigators reportedly considered the possibility that it was a copycat killing. That interpretation allowed the authorities to maintain a distinction between Christopher's case and the broader series. Yet the copycat theory also demonstrated the danger of relying too heavily on behavioral similarities. If one offender could imitate another, then similar crime scenes did not necessarily mean a single offender. The same knife wounds, the same general positioning of a body, or the same social setting could potentially appear in different cases for different reasons. This uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the Frankfurt investigation. There was another figure who appeared in later discussions of the case, a man sometimes referred to in secondary sources as the minister. According to those accounts, this individual was a white, middle-aged man whose general appearance was considered similar to the composite description. Some accounts associate him with a church in Frankfurt and describe him as someone who had a role resembling a counselor or advisor. Other accounts claim that he had a limp and wore glasses, characteristics that have been associated with descriptions of the unidentified man. But this is where the line between documented evidence and later theory must be drawn carefully. The available information does not establish that the minister was officially identified as the Frankfurt slasher. It does not establish that police proved he was responsible for the murders, and it does not provide sufficient evidence to treat the theory as fact. The name became part of later discussions surrounding the mystery, but that is different from a confirmed investigative conclusion. This distinction is especially important because unresolved cases tend to accumulate stories over time. When an investigation remains open or uncertain for years, people who remember the events may connect pieces of information that were never formally connected by investigators. A local rumor can become a repeated claim. A repeated claim can eventually appear to be an established fact simply because it has been repeated so often. The Frankfurt slasher case contains several examples of this problem. Some accounts confidently identify the number of victims. Others describe additional women as possible victims. Some sources give different dates or different counts of injuries. Some theories identify individuals who were never charged. The responsible way to approach the case is therefore to preserve those uncertainties rather than turn them into certainty. The investigation also faced the limitations of forensic science during the period. One of the most frequently discussed pieces of evidence in the Carol Dowd case was a tiny bloodstain found on a pair of Christopher's pants. But the stain was not enough to establish a blood type, and the available technology could not produce the kind of DNA identification that investigators might seek today. There was no confirmed weapon connecting Christopher to the wider series. There was no physical evidence described in the available material that conclusively linked him to the earlier victims. Those limitations did not prevent a conviction in Dowd's case, but they made it much more difficult to determine whether the same person had been responsible for the broader series. The investigation consequently became divided into two questions. The first was legal and specific. Did Leonard Christopher murder Carol Dowd? The second was broader and much more difficult. Who, if anyone, was responsible for the Frankfurt slasher series? The first question was eventually answered in court when Christopher was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The second remained unresolved. That unresolved second question is what gives the case its enduring mystery. A serial killer investigation usually seeks a pattern and then attempts to attach that pattern to a person. In Frankfurt, investigators appeared to have the first part without ever securing the second. They had names of victims. They had locations. They had similarities. They had witness descriptions. They had a composite sketch. They had a defendant in one homicide. But these pieces never formed a single, uncontested chain of evidence. And then there was the fact that Michelle Denner was killed while Christopher was already in custody. The case could not simply be closed by saying that the man arrested in connection with Dowd was the offender responsible for everything. At most, his conviction established his legal responsibility for one death. The larger pattern remained uncertain. By the end of the investigation, the unidentified man described by witnesses had become almost as important to the story as Christopher himself. One man had a name, a trial, and a sentence. The other had only descriptions and theories. One was legally convicted of a specific murder. The other disappeared into the uncertainty surrounding a group of killings that were never conclusively attributed to him. That contrast lies at the center of the Frankfurt slasher mystery. The police had found someone they could prosecute. They had not necessarily found the person they had been searching for since 1985. The death of Carol Dowd in April 1990 became the turning point in the Frankfurt investigation. Because unlike several of the earlier cases, investigators had a person who could be placed directly within the victim's immediate surroundings. Dowd, a woman in her mid-40s, was found dead on April 29, 1990, behind a seafood store on Frankfurt Avenue. The location immediately drew attention to Leonard Christopher, a 38-year-old African-American man who worked at the store. Christopher also knew Dowd. For investigators, that relationship was important. It meant that Christopher was not simply a stranger who happened to live somewhere in the same neighborhood. He had a connection to the victim and worked at the location where her body was discovered. After years of investigating murders in which the identity of the offender remained unknown, police now had a suspect whose movements and relationship with the victim could be examined. On May 5, 1990, Christopher was arrested and charged with Dowd's murder. The arrest did not, however, automatically answer the larger question surrounding the Frankfurt slasher. Christopher was accused of killing one woman. The police still had to determine whether there was any evidence linking him to the other deaths that had been associated with the suspected series. This distinction is essential because the name Frankfurt slasher had already acquired a meaning larger than any single homicide. The investigation concerned a suspected pattern involving multiple women, while Christopher's prosecution concerned Carol Dowd. The two questions could overlap, but they were not identical. Investigators examined Christopher's behavior and statements during the investigation. According to the available case material, police believed that he had been dishonest or inconsistent at certain points. Such behavior could appear suspicious to investigators, particularly when they were already examining a suspect with a direct connection to the victim. But suspicion is not the same as proof. A person can give inconsistent answers for many reasons, and a suspicious statement does not independently establish that a person committed a homicide. The prosecution, therefore, had to present the surrounding circumstances as a whole. One of the most discussed pieces of physical evidence was a small bloodstain found on a pair of Christopher's pants. In another case, blood on a suspect's clothing might immediately seem like a powerful forensic connection. But the evidence here had significant limitations. The amount of blood was extremely small, and investigators could not determine a blood type from it. More importantly, DNA testing was not available in the form that modern investigators would expect. There was therefore no definitive genetic identification establishing that the blood belonged to Dowd. The stain could be presented as suspicious, but it could not provide the kind of conclusive scientific link that would later become possible through DNA technology. The absence of a definitive forensic connection did not end the prosecution's case. Courts routinely consider circumstantial evidence, and the prosecution could argue that several circumstances pointed toward Christopher. He knew Dowd. He worked near the location where her body was found. Investigators considered his conduct during the investigation suspicious. There was a small bloodstain on his clothing. Taken together, prosecutors believed these facts supported their case. The defense challenged that interpretation. Attorney Jack McMahon questioned the significance of the evidence and the conclusions investigators had drawn from it. The defense position was important because the physical evidence did not independently identify Christopher as the killer. The bloodstain could not be conclusively identified as Dowd's. No weapon was definitively established as the murder weapon in the information available here. There was no direct eyewitness account described in the case material showing Christopher killing Dowd. The prosecution's case, therefore, depended substantially on circumstances surrounding the murder, rather than one decisive piece of evidence. The question of robbery also became part of the dispute. Investigators considered whether Dowd might have been killed during a robbery, but her wallet still contained money. That fact complicated the theory that the killing had been motivated by a straightforward theft. If money remained in the victim's possession, then the purpose of the attack was less obvious. The prosecution did not necessarily need to prove a simple financial motive, but the uncertainty surrounding motive gave the defense another avenue for challenging the state's interpretation of events. What was clear was that Dowd had died violently and that Christopher had a direct connection to the circumstances surrounding her death. What was less clear was exactly what had happened between them. That uncertainty was especially significant because the broader Frankfurt investigation already contained unresolved questions. Investigators had previously heard descriptions of a white, middle-aged man seen with some victims. Christopher did not match that description. If the witnesses had accurately described the person they had seen, then the man in their accounts could not have been Christopher. This created an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the man who killed Dowd was not the same person who had been seen with other victims. Or perhaps the witness descriptions belonged to a different part of the investigation entirely. The police, therefore, had to consider the possibility that Christopher's case and the Frankfurt slasher series were not the same thing. Yet the public perception of the case could easily blur that distinction. A man arrested after years of killings in the same neighborhood could quickly become identified with the entire series, even if the legal case against him involved only one victim. The later history of the investigation demonstrated why that distinction mattered. Christopher was arrested in May 1990, but Michelle Denner was murdered on September 6, 1990, while Christopher was already in custody. Denner was 30 years old and was killed on Arrett Street. Accounts describe multiple stab wounds, including 23 wounds to the chest and abdomen in one source. Her death had characteristics that investigators considered similar to the earlier killings. If Denner's murder truly belonged to the same series, Christopher could not have committed it. He was already imprisoned. Investigators reportedly considered the possibility that Denner's murder was a copycat killing, meaning that another offender had imitated the characteristics associated with the Frankfurt slasher. That theory preserved the possibility that Christopher had killed Dowd while separating Denner's murder from the original series. But it also created another problem. If someone else could imitate the pattern, then the similarities between the murders could not automatically establish that they had all been committed by one person. A copycat could reproduce elements of an earlier crime. Alternatively, several unrelated offenders could have committed murders that appeared similar because they occurred within the same neighborhood and involved similar circumstances. This uncertainty became central to the interpretation of the entire case. Christopher's trial eventually produced a legal conclusion. On December 12, 1990, he was convicted of murdering Carol Dowd and sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction established that, in the eyes of the court, Christopher was responsible for Dowd's death. But the conviction did not establish that he was responsible for Helen Patton, Anna Carroll, Susanna Alsop, Jean Durkin, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Sciortino, Catherine M. Jones, or Michelle Denner. Nor did it establish that he was the unidentified man described by witnesses. Those distinctions matter because later summaries of the case sometimes present Christopher as, though he had been identified as the Frankfurt slasher himself. The available information does not support such a simple conclusion. Christopher was convicted of one murder. The broader serial killer theory remained unresolved. Christopher maintained his innocence, and the weaknesses in the physical evidence continued to fuel questions about the conviction. The tiny bloodstain could not identify its source. There was no confirmed weapon connecting him to the larger series. There was no described physical evidence linking him to the earlier victims. And the eyewitness descriptions of a white, middle-aged man remained difficult to reconcile with his identity. None of these points, by themselves, proves that Christopher was innocent of Dowd's murder. They do, however, explain why the larger Frankfurt slasher mystery did not disappear after his conviction. In fact, the conviction created an unusual situation. A man had been legally punished for one of the deaths associated with the investigation, yet the broader pattern remained unexplained. If Christopher was guilty of killing Dowd, but unrelated to the other murders, then another offender remained unidentified. If Christopher was innocent of Dowd's murder, then the conviction had failed to identify the actual killer. And if the entire series had involved more than one offender, then the very concept of a single Frankfurt slasher might have been misleading from the beginning. The most unsettling fact was that the killing of Michelle Denner occurred after Christopher had already been taken into custody. That event made it impossible to close the entire story simply by pointing to Christopher. There was still a woman dead, still a neighborhood confronted with fear, and still no confirmed identity for the person who may have been responsible for the wider series. By December 1990, the courtroom had delivered its verdict in the Carol Dowd case. Christopher received a life sentence, and legally the prosecution had reached its conclusion. But the investigation that had begun with Helen Patton in 1985 had never been reduced to a single, unquestionable chain of evidence. The name Leonard Christopher now belonged permanently to the history of the Frankfurt murders. But his conviction answered only one part of the mystery. The larger question remained: if the Frankfurt slasher was a single person, who was he? And if that person was not Christopher, how many victims had actually belonged to the same series? The conviction brought a measure of legal finality to Carol Dowd's death. It did not bring the same finality to the women whose cases remained connected only by similarities, geography, witness memories, and unanswered questions. In that sense, December 1990 was not the end of the Frankfurt slasher investigation. It was the moment when two stories became permanently intertwined: the documented conviction of Leonard Christopher for Carol Dowd's murder, and the unresolved search for whoever may have been responsible for the broader series. The conviction of Leonard Christopher did not bring a clean ending to the Frankfurt killings. If anything, the murder of Michelle Denner made the unresolved questions more difficult. Denner was 30 years old, and on September 6, 1990, she was found dead in her apartment on Arrett Street. By that point, Christopher had already been arrested in connection with the death of Carol Dowd and was in custody. That single fact immediately changed the meaning of Denner's murder. If investigators were correct in believing that her death resembled the earlier Frankfurt killings, then Christopher could not have been the person who physically carried it out. He was incarcerated. He could not have been at Denner's apartment when she was killed. The timing therefore created one of the most important contradictions in the entire case. Either Denner's murder was unrelated, or someone else was reproducing the characteristics associated with the suspected Frankfurt slasher. Investigators reportedly considered the latter possibility and described the killing as a possible copycat murder. But the word copycat is important. It offered an explanation, but it did not solve the mystery. A copycat theory assumes that there was an original pattern worth imitating. It also assumes that the person committing the later murder knew enough about the earlier cases to reproduce some of their characteristics. Yet the available information does not establish who that person was, why the killing was committed, or how closely the crime actually matched the earlier murders. What remained certain was that another woman had died after Christopher was already behind bars. Denner's murder therefore forced investigators and the public to separate two questions that had increasingly become confused. Who killed Carol Dowd? And who was responsible for the larger series of women associated with the Frankfurt slasher case? Those questions could not automatically have the same answer. Denner's own history added another layer of complexity. According to the material surrounding the case, She had previously been regarded as a possible suspect in one of the earlier killings because she had been involved in an altercation with another victim. That meant that her name had already appeared in the investigation from the opposite side of the case. She had once been considered someone who might have information or responsibility. Now she was herself dead. The transformation from possible suspect to victim illustrates how uncertain the investigation had become. Investigators were trying to determine relationships between women, locations, bars, and possible offenders, but each new piece of information could alter their understanding of the previous cases. Denner reportedly lived alone and, like several of the women associated with the investigation, was known to frequent bars along Frankfurt Avenue. That detail again brought the investigation back to the neighborhood's social geography. Frankfurt Avenue was not simply a street appearing on a map. It was part of the everyday lives of the women involved. Bars provided places where people met, drank, talked, and sometimes left with people they knew only casually. If the unidentified man described by witnesses really was connected to the killings, such locations could have provided opportunities for contact. But the evidence available here does not establish that Denner was deliberately selected in a bar, nor does it prove that the man seen with her was the same person described by witnesses in earlier cases. One of the most significant details surrounding Denner was precisely that possibility. Some accounts state that she had been seen drinking with a white, middle-aged man on Frankfurt Avenue before her death. This description echoed the witness accounts that had troubled investigators throughout the earlier investigation. Again, however, the description did not produce a confirmed identity. There was no established name attached to the man. There was no documented proof in the available material that he was the killer. And there was no confirmed evidence that he was even connected to every murder attributed to the Frankfurt slasher. Nevertheless, the recurrence of the description mattered. A white, middle-aged man had appeared in witness accounts before. Now a similar description appeared in connection with another victim. Meanwhile, the man who had been convicted of Carol Dowd's murder was physically unable to commit Denner's killing. The contradiction could not simply be ignored. It created the possibility that the investigation had focused too heavily on Christopher Weil. Another offender remained unidentified. At the same time, the existence of Denner's murder did not automatically prove that Christopher was innocent of Dowd's death. That distinction is critical. Christopher's incarceration prevented him from killing Denner. It did not determine whether he had killed Dowd months earlier. The legal case against Christopher had already proceeded independently. He had been convicted on December 12, 1990, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Denner's murder could therefore not erase that conviction by itself. What it did was weaken any simplistic assumption that the conviction had solved the broader series. If Christopher had been the only killer, how could another apparently similar murder occur while he was imprisoned? The copycat theory answered that question in one possible way. Another offender could have deliberately imitated the earlier crimes. But even that explanation left an unanswered question. Who was the original offender? The case consequently became a maze of competing possibilities. Perhaps there was one serial killer. Perhaps there were two. Perhaps several unrelated killers operated in the same area over a period of years. Perhaps some of the deaths included in later lists were never connected to the series at all. Perhaps some similarities were meaningful, while others were simply the result of investigators looking backward and trying to find a pattern. These possibilities are not equally supported, but the available information does not allow one of them to be declared definitively correct. This is why the terminology surrounding the victims matters. Rather than describing all 9 women as unquestionably killed by one person, it is more accurate to describe them as possible or suspected victims of the Frankfurt slasher series. The distinction may sound technical, but it changes the way the entire story should be understood. Helen Patent, Anna Carroll, Susanna Alsop, Jean Durkin, Catherine M. Jones, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Ciortino, Carol Dowd, and Michelle Denner are often presented together in lists of the suspected victims. Yet the strength of the connection varies. Catherine Jones, in particular, has been identified in some sources while her connection to the series remains disputed. The dates and details of some cases also vary between sources. Even the precise date associated with Helen Patton's death has been reported differently, making August 1985 a safer description than asserting one exact date without access to the original record. These inconsistencies do not mean the murders were imaginary or insignificant. They demonstrate how difficult it can be to reconstruct an older criminal investigation from surviving accounts. The Frankfurt case also reveals the limitations faced by investigators in the late 1980s. Modern audiences are accustomed to DNA databases, high-resolution surveillance footage, digital communications, and forensic techniques capable of extracting genetic information from extremely small samples. Those tools were either unavailable or far less developed during the period when these murders occurred. In Christopher's case, investigators reportedly found a very small bloodstain on his pants, but it could not establish even the blood type. There was no modern DNA profile that could be compared against a database or conclusively tied to Dowd. That limitation became especially significant because the wider investigation depended so heavily on identifying patterns. Without a decisive forensic link, investigators had to rely on witness recollections, circumstances, relationships, statements, and the physical characteristics of crime scenes. Each category had weaknesses. Witnesses could be mistaken. Circumstantial evidence could have multiple interpretations. Similar crime scenes could be created by different offenders. And a person who knew a victim could be suspicious without necessarily being guilty. Denner's death, therefore, became a kind of dividing line in the story. Before her murder, investigators could still hope that Christopher's arrest might eventually provide an explanation for the series. After her murder, that explanation was no longer sufficient. A woman had been killed while Christopher was imprisoned. The broader mystery remained alive. The unidentified white, middle-aged man remained unidentified. The composite sketch had not produced a definitive suspect. The possible victims remained a mixture of confirmed homicides and disputed connections. And Christopher, despite his conviction for Dowd's murder, had never been proven responsible for the entire series. There is something particularly unsettling about that uncertainty because a criminal investigation normally seeks closure through a name. A victim has a name. A suspect has a name. A courtroom produces a verdict. A sentence follows. But in the Frankfurt case, the name of the person responsible for the broader pattern remained absent. There was no final courtroom moment in which the alleged serial killer was identified and held accountable for every death. Instead, there was a collection of women whose lives ended violently, a convicted man associated with one of those deaths, and a second killing that occurred while he was already incarcerated. Denner's death did not solve the mystery. It made the mystery harder to simplify, and that is why the case continued to resist a definitive conclusion. The question was no longer simply whether police had arrested the right man. The deeper question was whether they had ever identified the same killer at all. By the time investigators had reached the final years of the Frankfurt killings, one detail continued to resist every attempt at resolution: the description of an unidentified white, middle-aged man who had reportedly been seen with some of the victims before their deaths. In a case already complicated by conflicting evidence, disputed connections, and the conviction of Leonard Christopher for Carol Dowd's murder, that description became one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. It was also one of the least conclusive. A witness description can be valuable, but it is not a photograph. Memories fade, circumstances affect perception, and a person seen briefly in a public place can be difficult to identify with certainty. In the Frankfurt investigation, those limitations became especially important because the man described by witnesses did not fit Leonard Christopher. Christopher was an African-American man. The unidentified person described in the available accounts was white. That difference did not prove that Christopher was innocent of Dowd's murder. But it created a serious obstacle to the idea that he had been the single offender responsible for the entire series. The unidentified man reportedly appeared in the lives of several victims through the same social environment that repeatedly surfaced throughout the investigation. Frankfort Avenue and its bars. The women associated with the suspected series were not necessarily strangers to the neighborhood. Some were known to frequent bars in the area, and that common setting gave investigators a possible point of connection. It also created an unsettling possibility. If a killer had been selecting victims from the same local environment, he might not have needed to force contact. He could potentially have approached women in places where conversation and drinking were ordinary. A stranger in a dark alley might immediately attract suspicion. A man talking to someone in a neighborhood bar would not necessarily stand out at all. But the available information does not establish that this was precisely how the murders occurred. It is important to separate what witnesses reported from what investigators might have inferred. The witnesses provided descriptions. They did not provide a confirmed identity. There is no established evidence in the material provided that the unidentified man was responsible for every death associated with the Frankfurt slasher. He remains an unresolved figure rather than a proven killer. At some stage, investigators created or used a composite sketch based on witness descriptions. The purpose of such a sketch was straightforward: turn memory into an image that could be shown to the public and potentially recognized by someone who knew the man. But a composite sketch can only be as accurate as the memories behind it. If several witnesses remember different aspects of the same person, the resulting image can narrow the possibilities without necessarily producing a name. That appears to be what happened in this case. The sketch did not lead to a publicly confirmed identification of the Frankfurt slasher. The man remained unidentified. This failure is particularly significant because the investigation had already experienced another problem. The apparent similarities among the murders did not automatically establish that one person had committed them all. The women were found in circumstances that investigators considered similar. There were repeated reports of knife attacks, sexual assault indicators, and bodies left in positions that suggested deliberate staging. But similar methods can produce misleading patterns. A killer can imitate another killer. Two unrelated offenders can use similar methods. Investigators can also overestimate similarities when they examine old cases together. The Frankfurt slasher label therefore carried a degree of uncertainty from the beginning. It described a suspected pattern rather than a confirmed identity. The murder of Michelle Denner intensified this problem. Denner was killed on September 6, 1990, after Christopher had already been taken into custody. Some accounts describe her as having been seen drinking with a white, middle-aged man before her death. Once again, the description echoed the unidentified figure associated with earlier witness accounts. If the same man had actually been with multiple victims shortly before their deaths, that would have been an important lead. But there is no documented conclusion in the material provided that he was definitively the person responsible. Investigators reportedly considered Denner's murder a possible copycat killing. That interpretation allowed them to explain how a similar murder could occur while Christopher was incarcerated. Yet it also left the larger mystery intact. A copycat could imitate a known pattern, but the identity of the original offender would still need to be established. The copycat theory therefore solved one contradiction without solving the central question. It also illustrates how difficult the investigation had become. Every possible answer seemed to create another question. If Christopher was the killer of Dowd, who killed Denner? If Denner was killed by a copycat, who was the original Frankfurt slasher? If the unidentified white man was the killer, why was there never enough evidence to identify him? If the murders involved several offenders, why did so many of the cases share characteristics? And if some of the suspected victims were never part of the same series, which deaths actually belonged together? These questions remained unresolved. Another person sometimes mentioned in later discussions of the case was a man referred to as the minister. According to secondary accounts and community discussions, This figure was believed by some people to resemble the composite sketch. He was described as a white, middle-aged man who wore glasses and walked with a limp. Some accounts associated him with a church in Frankfurt and suggested that he had a counseling or advisory role. These details have contributed to theories that the minister might have been the unidentified man sought by investigators. But this is precisely where responsible storytelling requires caution. The available material does not provide sufficient official evidence to establish that the minister was the Frankfurt slasher. The name appears primarily in later accounts, community recollections, and discussions rather than in a documented conviction or definitive investigative finding. It would therefore be misleading to present him as the killer. At most, he can be described as a person who became part of later theories surrounding the unidentified man. The distinction between a person of interest and a proven offender is fundamental. In an unsolved case, speculation can easily become accepted as fact simply because a theory is repeated often enough. A composite sketch becomes a suspect. A suspect becomes a person of interest. A person of interest eventually becomes the killer in retellings. But the evidence does not change simply because the story is repeated. The Frankfurt slasher case is especially vulnerable to this process because there is no definitive ending to correct the record. There was no trial establishing the identity of the serial killer. There was no forensic result publicly identifying a single offender across the suspected victims. There was no confession that conclusively explained the entire series. Instead, the case remained suspended between evidence and possibility. The passage of time made the situation even more difficult. The killings occurred in the 1980s and 1990. Many of the investigative techniques available today either did not exist or were not sufficiently developed at the time. The tiny bloodstain found on Christopher's clothing could not be used in the way modern DNA evidence might be used. Witness memories became older with every passing year. Physical evidence could be lost, degraded, or remain insufficient for modern testing. And the people who might once have recognized the unidentified man could have moved away, forgotten details, or died. A cold case does not simply remain unchanged. Time can slowly remove the information investigators need most. Yet the Frankfurt investigation also demonstrates why the identity of a suspected serial killer cannot be established simply through geography and similarity. The victims were connected by place, circumstances, and recurring characteristics. Those connections were enough to raise alarm. They were enough to justify investigation. But they were not enough to prove a single offender. That is why the phrase suspected victims is more accurate than presenting every woman in the commonly repeated list as unquestionably killed by the same person. Helen Patent, Anna Carroll, Susanna Alsop, Jean Durkin, Catherine M. Jones, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Sciortino, Carol Dowd, and Michelle Denner are associated with the Frankfurt slasher narrative, but the strength of that association varies. Catherine Jones's inclusion, in particular, has been disputed. Even the dates reported for some of the earlier cases differ between sources. Such inconsistencies matter when reconstructing an old investigation. They remind us that the story we inherit is not necessarily identical to the evidence investigators originally possessed. Ultimately, the unidentified man remains one of the central unanswered elements of the Frankfurt slasher case. He represents the possibility that investigators were looking for someone other than Leonard Christopher. He also represents the limitations of eyewitness evidence. A face was remembered. A description was created. A sketch was circulated. Yet a name never emerged with enough certainty to close the investigation. For the families of the women whose deaths remain associated with the case, that uncertainty is not an abstract mystery. It means that the person who may have taken their loved ones' lives was never definitively identified. The story, therefore, cannot end with the conviction of Leonard Christopher. His legal case concerned Carol Dowd. The broader question remained open. somewhere within the distance between what witnesses remembered, what investigators believed, and what the evidence could actually prove, the identity of the Frankfurt slasher disappeared. And unlike a suspect standing in a courtroom, that unidentified figure left no final answer behind. By the beginning of the 1990s, the Frankfurt slasher investigation had reached a point where the distinction between a solved murder and an unsolved series could no longer be ignored. Leonard Christopher had been convicted of killing Carol Dowd and sentenced to life imprisonment. Legally, there was a verdict. A woman had been murdered, a defendant had been tried, and a court had reached a conclusion. But the conviction did not identify the person responsible for the broader group of killings associated with the Frankfurt slasher. That distinction became increasingly important because Michelle Denner had been murdered while Christopher was already in custody. The existence of another killing during his imprisonment did not, by itself, overturn his conviction for Dowd's death. But it made it impossible to treat Christopher's conviction as the definitive solution to the entire series. The case therefore divided into two separate stories. The first was the prosecution of Leonard Christopher for Carol Dowd's murder. The second was the unresolved investigation into the women whose deaths had been connected, with varying degrees of certainty, to the Frankfurt slasher. Those two stories overlapped, but they were never proven to be identical. Christopher's conviction rested on the circumstances surrounding Dowd's death. He knew her. He worked at a seafood store near the location where her body was found. Investigators considered his behavior suspicious, and the prosecution presented circumstances that they believed connected him to the killing. Yet the physical evidence described in the available material was limited. A very small bloodstain was reportedly found on a pair of Christopher's pants, but the sample was too limited to establish even a blood type. There was no modern DNA analysis capable of identifying the source of the blood. No definitive murder weapon was established. No eyewitness was presented who had directly seen Christopher kill Dowd. The case therefore depended heavily on circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful. A collection of independent circumstances can establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But it is also important to understand what such evidence does and does not prove. Evidence connecting a person to one victim does not automatically connect that person to other victims. A conviction for one murder is not a conviction for a series of murders. That distinction became central to the Frankfurt case. Christopher was not convicted of killing Helen Patton, Anna Carroll, Susanna Alsop, Jean Durkin, Catherine M. Jones, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Sciortino, or Michelle Denner. He was convicted in connection with Carol Dowd. The remaining deaths remained unresolved or disputed. This distinction is especially important when looking back at the case decades later, because later retellings sometimes compress the story into a simpler narrative. The Frankfurt slasher was Leonard Christopher, police caught him, and the case ended. But the available information does not support such a straightforward conclusion. The unresolved identity of the suspected serial killer remained a problem even after Christopher's conviction. One of the strongest reasons was the recurring description of a white, middle-aged man reportedly seen with some of the women before their deaths. That description did not match Christopher. The discrepancy could not be dismissed as a minor detail if the witnesses were accurately describing a person who had been with multiple victims shortly before they were killed. At the same time, eyewitness descriptions are not infallible. The witnesses may have remembered incorrectly, may have seen different men, or may have encountered individuals who had no connection to the murders. Without independent evidence confirming the identity of the man, the description remained a lead rather than a conclusion. The composite sketch represented an attempt to transform those memories into something investigators could use. Yet the sketch never produced a publicly confirmed identity of the Frankfurt slasher. This is where the case became a study in uncertainty. Every possible explanation contained a weakness. If Christopher was responsible for Dowd's death but not the others, then another killer remained unidentified. If Christopher had been responsible for the broader series, the killing of Denner while he was incarcerated required another explanation. Investigators reportedly considered Denner's murder a possible copycat killing. That possibility meant another person could have deliberately reproduced characteristics associated with the earlier killings. But even if that explanation were correct, it would not identify the original offender. It would merely separate the later murder from the earlier series. And if the later murder was not a copycat at all, then the case became even more complicated. The possibility remained that multiple offenders had operated in the same general area over several years. This possibility should not be dismissed simply because the cases shared characteristics. Knife attacks, sexual assault indicators, and stage bodies could be significant similarities, but they were not proof that one person had committed every murder. The same neighborhood could also produce multiple unrelated crimes. Philadelphia during this period was experiencing a large number of homicides, meaning investigators were working within a broader environment of serious violent crime. A pattern could be real, but it could also be distorted by the sheer number of cases occurring around the same time. The women themselves should not disappear behind the label attached to the suspected killer. Helen Patent, Anna Carroll, Susanna Alsop, Jean Durkin, Catherine M. Jones, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Sciortino, Carol Dowd, and Michelle Denner were individuals whose lives existed independently of the investigation. They had families, relationships, routines, and places they knew. Yet after their deaths, much of the public story became focused on the person who might have killed them. The danger in a case like this is that the victims can become a list of names beneath a sensational nickname. The more responsible way to understand the investigation is to remember that the uncertainty surrounding the killer does not diminish the reality of their deaths. It only means that the evidence has never provided a definitive explanation for all of them. The passage of time added another obstacle. The killings occurred between 1985 and 1990, before many of the forensic capabilities that investigators would have available today. DNA evidence, in particular, transformed homicide investigations in later decades. But the existence of modern technology does not automatically mean that old evidence can now solve a case. Biological material must have survived. It must have been properly preserved. It must be sufficient for testing. And even if a DNA profile can be developed, investigators need something against which to compare it. In the Frankfurt case, the information provided does not establish that a definitive DNA profile of the suspected serial killer exists, nor does it establish that modern testing has conclusively identified one person responsible for the series. The tiny bloodstain associated with Christopher illustrates the limitations of the period. Today, a very small biological sample can potentially be extremely valuable. At the time, however, the sample reportedly could not even establish a blood type. The difference between those two eras is enormous. It also explains why some questions from the original investigation remain unanswered. The case contains another uncertainty: the exact boundaries of the series. Some lists identify 9 suspected victims, but not every source agrees that all 9 deaths were committed by the same offender. Catherine Jones's connection, in particular, has been disputed. Dates and details concerning some of the earlier cases also vary between sources. Even the precise date associated with Helen Patent's death has been reported differently. Such discrepancies may seem minor, but in a cold case investigation they matter. A reliable timeline is one of the foundations of determining whether crimes are connected. If dates, locations, and circumstances are uncertain, then the pattern itself becomes harder to establish. That does not mean the Frankfurt slasher theory is false. It means the theory must be presented with the same caution that investigators should have used from the beginning, as a hypothesis supported by similarities, rather than as a proven fact. There is also the later theory surrounding a man referred to by some sources as the Minister. He was reportedly described as a white, middle-aged man with glasses and a limp. characteristics that some people believed resembled the composite sketch. According to later accounts, he had some connection to a church in Frankfurt. But these claims remain part of the unresolved theory surrounding the case. There is no established evidence in the material provided that proves he was the Frankfurt slasher. That uncertainty is essential. A name attached to an old case can become powerful simply through repetition. Once a person is repeatedly described as a suspect, later audiences may assume that investigators proved the connection. They did not. In the absence of a conviction or definitive forensic evidence, the responsible conclusion is that the identity of the broader offender remains unresolved. Leonard Christopher's story ended differently. He was convicted of Carol Dowd's murder and spent the remainder of his life in prison. He continued to maintain his innocence. Eventually, he died of cancer while incarcerated. His death removed any possibility of questioning him further in the future. But it did not answer the larger questions surrounding the suspected series. If Christopher was guilty of killing Dowd, then his conviction provided a legal answer for one victim. If he was not, then the person responsible remained free for years afterward. And if the other killings were committed by different offenders, then the phrase Frankfurt slasher may have combined several separate tragedies into one narrative. These possibilities cannot be resolved simply by choosing the most dramatic explanation. The evidence must determine the conclusion, and the evidence available here does not provide that certainty. What remains, then, is a case defined as much by what investigators could not prove as by what they could. There was a conviction, but no confirmed serial killer. There was a composite sketch, but no definitive identity. There were similarities between crimes, but no conclusive forensic link across the entire series. There was another murder while Christopher was imprisoned, but no certainty about whether it was a copycat killing or part of a different pattern. And there were women whose deaths continued to be associated with the Frankfurt slasher despite uncertainty about whether one person was responsible for all of them. That is the real legacy of the case. It is not simply the story of a mysterious killer who vanished. It is the story of an investigation that reached one courtroom conclusion without resolving the larger mystery. For the victims' families, that distinction matters. A conviction can provide an answer, but only when it answers the question that needs answering. In the Frankfurt slasher case, one question received a verdict. Who was convicted in the death of Carol Dowd? Leonard Christopher. The larger question remained, who, if anyone, was responsible for the series of murders attributed to the Frankfurt slasher? There is no definitive answer, and that is why the case remains unresolved. The conviction of Leonard Christopher did not bring the Frankfurt slasher investigation to the kind of ending that a conventional murder case usually receives. There was no single moment when investigators could say that the danger had been identified, the killer had been caught, and the story was over. Instead, the conviction created another layer of uncertainty. Christopher had been found guilty of killing Carol Dowd, but the larger series of deaths remained unresolved. The distinction was not merely technical. It shaped the entire meaning of the case. If Christopher had been responsible for Dowd's death, that did not establish that he had killed Helen Patton, Anna Carroll, Susanna Alsop, Jean Durkin, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Ciortino, or any of the other women whose names had become associated with the Frankfurt slasher. And if he had not been responsible for the broader series, then the person who had committed those killings had never been identified. The death of Michelle Denner made that uncertainty impossible to ignore. Denner was killed on September 6, 1990, while Christopher was already in custody. Her death occurred months after Dowd's murder and after Christopher's arrest. The circumstances reportedly contained similarities to the earlier cases, including a knife attack and the presence of characteristics that had caused investigators to associate the earlier murders with one another. That created a contradiction at the heart of the investigation. A man could not be in jail and simultaneously be committing a murder outside the prison. The contradiction did not automatically prove that Christopher had been wrongly convicted of Dowd's murder. But it did demonstrate that his incarceration could not have ended every threat associated with the Frankfurt cases. Investigators reportedly considered Denner's killing a possible copycat murder. That explanation offered one way to reconcile the timeline. Another offender could have intentionally imitated characteristics of the earlier killings, creating the appearance that the same killer was still active. But the copycat theory had its own limitation. It could explain Denner without identifying the original offender. The question, therefore, remained open. Who had killed the women whose cases appeared to form the earlier pattern? The uncertainty became even more significant because of witness accounts concerning a white, middle-aged man. Some witnesses reportedly remembered seeing victims with such a man before their deaths. That description was important because it suggested a possible common point of contact. It also conflicted with Christopher's appearance. The witnesses were not describing an African-American man. They were describing someone else. Investigators reportedly used a composite sketch in an effort to identify him. But the search did not produce a definitive answer. A sketch can put a face to a memory, but it cannot guarantee that the memory is correct. A witness may remember the general shape of a face, but not the details. A person may appear different under different lighting. Someone seen briefly in a bar may be remembered differently after weeks, months, or years. And in a case where several victims and witnesses passed through the same neighborhood, there could have been many men who resembled the description without having any connection to the murders. That uncertainty meant the unidentified man could never become a proven suspect merely because he appeared in the narrative. He remained one of the most important unresolved leads. Later theories surrounding a man referred to as the minister added another layer to the mystery. Some accounts claimed that this person resembled the composite sketch and was a white, middle-aged man who wore glasses and walked with a limp. Other accounts associated him with a church in Frankfurt. Those details have encouraged speculation that he might have been the person witnesses saw with some of the victims. But there is no established evidence in the material available here proving that the minister was the Frankfurt slasher. That distinction matters because an unsolved case creates an environment where theories can gradually become accepted as facts. A name can appear in one account, be repeated in another, and eventually be presented as though investigators had officially identified a suspect. But repetition is not proof. Without a confirmed identification, forensic evidence, confession, or conviction connecting that individual to the killings, the theory remains a theory. The same caution applies to the number of victims. The commonly repeated list contains 9 women: Helen Patton, Anna Carroll, Susanna Alsop, Jean Durkin, Catherine M. Jones, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Ciartino, Carol Dowd, and Michelle Denner. Yet the strength of the connection varies. Catherine Jones's inclusion has been disputed. Some details about the dates and circumstances of the murders differ between sources. Even the exact date associated with Helen Patton's death is not consistent across all accounts. These discrepancies do not erase the similarities that caused investigators to consider the cases together, but they do mean that the series must be described carefully. The most accurate language is not that 9 women were definitively murdered by one serial killer. It is that a group of approximately 8 or 9 deaths became associated with a suspected series, known as the Frankfurt slasher murders. That distinction protects the integrity of the victims' stories as well as the historical record. The investigation also illustrates the limitations of forensic science during the period. The evidence associated with Christopher included a very small bloodstain reportedly found on a pair of his pants. The stain could not establish a blood type and could not provide the kind of DNA identification that investigators might seek today. There was no definitive weapon connecting Christopher to Dowd in the information provided, and there was no physical evidence clearly linking him to the other suspected victims. Modern audiences sometimes imagine that every murder investigation contains a large collection of scientific evidence waiting to reveal the truth. In reality, many cases from the 1980s depended heavily on witness testimony, circumstances, interviews, and physical evidence that could be limited or inconclusive. The absence of modern DNA analysis did not mean investigators were careless. It meant they were working with the tools available to them. That difference is essential when judging an investigation decades later. It is also important to recognize what the conviction of Christopher actually accomplished. The legal system reached a conclusion regarding Carol Dowd's death. Christopher was convicted on December 12, 1990, and received a life sentence. He maintained that he was innocent. His conviction did not establish him as the killer responsible for the entire Frankfurt series, nor did it resolve the identity of the unidentified man described by witnesses. The case therefore contained two separate truths that could exist simultaneously. One truth was legal. Leonard Christopher was convicted of Carol Dowd's murder. The other was investigative. The broader Frankfurt slasher mystery remained unresolved. Over time, these two truths could easily become confused. A later writer might describe Christopher simply as the Frankfurt slasher because his name was the one associated with the final investigation. A reader encountering the case years later might assume that the conviction had closed every murder. But the chronology tells a more complicated story. Christopher was arrested after Dowd's death. Dinner was killed while he was in custody. Witnesses had described another man, and there was no established forensic evidence tying Christopher to the entire group of suspected victims. The case therefore resisted a simple conclusion. For the families of the women involved, the uncertainty was not an academic problem. The passage of time does not make an unanswered death less painful. If the person responsible was never identified, then the family was left without the certainty that a conventional conviction can sometimes provide. Even when a suspect is convicted, families may continue to question whether the verdict reflects the complete truth. In the Frankfurt case, that uncertainty was particularly severe because the name of the suspected serial killer itself remained unresolved. The women became linked by a label rather than by a definitive answer. Their individual lives risked being reduced to a sequence of dates and injuries. Yet the most important fact about each case is that there was a person behind each name. Helen Patton was not simply a first victim. Anna Carroll was not merely the second case in a timeline. Susanna Alsop was not simply another entry in a list. Jean Durkin, Margaret Vaughn, Teresa Ciortino, Carol Dowd, and Michelle Denner were individuals whose lives ended violently. Catherine Jones, whether or not her death belonged to the series, also deserves to be remembered as a person rather than merely as a disputed entry in an investigation. That is perhaps the most difficult aspect of unresolved true crime cases. The mystery tends to survive more easily than the people who were lost. The killer, real or suspected, becomes the central character in public memory, while the victims become names surrounding him. But the unresolved nature of the Frankfurt investigation makes it even more important to reverse that perspective. There is no confirmed identity to place at the center of the story. There is only a series of deaths, an investigation, a conviction in one case, and questions that remained unanswered. Leonard Christopher eventually died of cancer while incarcerated. His death meant that whatever he knew about Carol Dowd or the other killings could never be clarified through further questioning. If he was guilty of Dowd's murder, the conviction remained the legal conclusion. If he was innocent, then the person who killed Dowd escaped justice. And if he was guilty of Dowd, but unrelated to the other deaths, then the Frankfurt slasher remained someone else entirely. Each possibility leads back to the same unresolved point. The investigation had produced a conviction, but not a definitive explanation. That is why the Frankfurt slasher case remains disturbing. It does not end with a dramatic confession, a final piece of forensic evidence, or a suspect standing before a court and admitting what he did. Instead, it ends with uncertainty. A name was attached to one murder. A face was placed on a composite sketch. A theory emerged around an unidentified man. Another woman was killed, while the convicted man, was already behind bars. And somewhere between those facts, the identity of the person responsible for the broader series remained out of reach. For the families, that unanswered question could never be reduced to a mystery story. It was the absence of certainty about someone they loved. And for the historical record, that uncertainty is precisely why the Frankfurt slasher should not be presented as a solved serial killer case. Leonard Christopher was convicted of killing Carol Dowd. That is a matter of record within the supplied account. The identity of the person responsible for the broader Frankfurt slasher series, however, remains unresolved. The verdict closed one chapter. It did not close the entire story.